Welcome to our second week in a different format of church school at Grace United Methodist Church in Winfield. Our format now is dealing with questions that participants in the church school experience have asked. And last week we began with questions about really around the issue of how in the world did the United Methodist Church get to where we are today? And we looked at that last week, and as a way of looking at church history is to look at the separations that have occurred throughout the world, in the United States, and within the United Methodist Church. One way to understand church history is just to look at separations. So the impending separation in the United Methodist Church is, as we said last week, is not sinful. It's not a sign of failure. It's just another step in the progression of Christian history. And indeed, it might be fair to say incompatibility is experienced in the church as well as life. And when incompatibility exists, obviously separation is one of the options. Now, this week we continue the same subject in a different way because several of you asked the question, what in the world is the future of the United Methodist Church post-separation? But I'm really convinced that the only way that we can look at where the future might be is to name and claim our present reality, sort of the state of affairs in the United Methodist Church today. And I, on my own, have identified three conditions in the church today that I think are the components of our dilemma. So, first of all, let me name and claim those three components of our dilemma. The first one is that it's the component of ambiguity. We are not clear concerning our identity. Some of you know I'm a fan of the book made up of Dag Hammarskjöld's markings, his gems of wisdom throughout his life. He was the General Secretary of the United Nations when he died in a very suspicious plane crash. But Markings is a precious book for me, and one of his markings is three words, and that is that identity is maturity. Maturity is identity. When you're immature, it's usually because your identity is not clear. And that happens on an individual basis and on a group basis. It's also true that when an organization or an individual is mature, lo and behold, the identity of that person or that group seems to be clear. Well, quite frankly, we're ambiguous concerning our identity. And I think in 2019 in the General Conference, immature attitudes and behavior were exhibited. Childlike responses, rampant disrespect of others, ill-founded accusations dominated that conference. Why did this occur? I believe it occurred because the identity of the United Methodist Church is at best fuzzy and at worst intentionally camouflaged. So our first condition is ambiguity in terms of our identity. Secondly, beyond ambiguity, I think another condition is in the United States, the cultural value of narcissism has invaded all churches, including the United Methodist Church. Now, narcissism is simply radical self-centeredness. And that is that all that happens that matters is how it affects me. And that narcissism has invaded the church. It's often expressed this way: whether or not I attend the 3 simple rules of doing no harm and doing good and loving God through worship and the sacraments and study, whether or not I do that, whether or not I'm involved in the community of faith called the church, is whether or not I get something out of it. If I don't get something out of it, count me out, is the attitude of many who have been a part of any church, including the United Methodist Church, and have withdrawn their involvement. One of the ways that I experience this is that for many in the church, the importance of the church is only their personal salvation or for their own personal satisfaction. Personal salvation or personal satisfaction are signs of how narcissism has invaded the life of the church. So ambiguity of identity, narcissism, and the third component that I would lift up would be that the United Methodist Church has circled the wagons. We've sort of taken a defensive posture, focused on sort of protecting ourselves, sometimes just saving ourselves, rather than developing new roads and avenues of service and engagement with the world. We've circled the wagons. Now, in the frontier, the wagons were circled because of impending harm from the enemy, and they could defend themselves better if the wagons were circled. It was circling the wagons is certainly understandable as a temporary tactic in any journey. But when circling the wagons becomes a permanent tactic, what happens? There's no movement forward on the trail. Circling the wagons guarantees that you simply sit still. There's no movement on. And indeed, what's happened in the United Methodist Church is that we've circled the wagons. It's become sort of a permanent lifestyle, and we've discovered, lo and behold, the enemy is from within, and that causes death and destruction. So we have these 3 conditions that are sort of the components of our dilemma in the United Methodist Church today. Now, I could add 4, 5, and 6, but I've just concluded that these 3 are, in my experience, the most basic. So let's deal with the question, what's the future? If that's sort of our dilemma, what's the future? Well, to be sure, the future of the United Methodist Church is that we're going to be smaller. But this is not a negative for me, for I find no basis in our library, the Bible. I see no basis in the tradition of the church that says faithfulness is determined by numbers. Faithfulness is determined when the church is aligned with God's love, not by the number of adherents, the number of members. It's determined by whether or not those who are a part of the church are aligned with God's love. So first of all, the church is going to be smaller, but with clarity of identity. I'm convinced that separation is going to lift the fog of confusion. We're going to be those who affirm those 3 simple rules that we talked about last week. Do good, do no harm, and stay in love with God through worship, sacraments, and study in the community of faith. That identity is going to be clear as we go into God's world to serve. Secondly, we're going to be smaller, but we're going to be released from the imprisonment of narcissism by following Jesus, not for the sake of ourselves. We don't follow Jesus for the sake of our own personal satisfaction or our own personal salvation. We follow Jesus for the sake of others. Finally, we're going to be smaller, but we're no longer going to be energized by circling the wagons, focused on our enemies, but rather we're going to be on the move with open doors without any exceptions, with open hearts without any exceptions, with open minds to experience new revelations of God's love in the world, empathetic and sacrificial love, to discover that and celebrate that every day of our lives as individuals and in the life of the church. So that's what I see the future as, addressing those components of our dilemma by the 3 simple rules, abandoning narcissism for the service of others, and instead of circling the wagons, going forth in our journey of openness. Now, I'm going to take a couple minutes to paint a picture of what this future of the United Methodist Church looks like in real life. I was Angola, in the country of Angola in Africa. Went to a church on a Tuesday. I was the first bishop to visit Angola in a long time. The Civil War was taking place, and for that and other reasons, other bishops had not gone. But I was there. And I went to this church in Luanda, Angola. And on Tuesday, and the church was full because the bishop from the United States was there. It's a big deal. But there was a sort of a daycare nursery as a part of the church, sort of next door. And so I was introduced to the director of the daycare, and she was of the age that I thought likely would have a child in the daycare. And I said, are one of these one of your children? She said, oh no, it used to be. And I thought, I said, well, where's your child now? Well, I've got another person taking care of my child. And she said, I was just a wandering person in Luanda, and I heard about this church. And I came, and they took my child in and took care of my child in the daycare. And finally, one day, I realized I wanted to be a part of that. And so I joined the church. I was baptized. And when I was baptized, I took my child out and gave my child to the commitment of another's care. And I said, well then, who are these children? And in Portuguese she spoke, and the translator paused for just a moment and then gave me the words, "This is the not yet church." Identity was clear. Narcissism was not present. There was no circling the wagons. All there was the United Methodist Church in Angola moving forward to serve. And that, to me, is my hope of the future of the United Methodist Church post-separation. Now, there's a lot to think about, but let me give you just 3 questions. First of all, what are our experiences of ambiguity, narcissism, and circling the wagons in the life of the church? Secondly, what are our experiences of the 3 simple rules, serving others rather than serving ourselves, and open doors, open hearts, and open minds in the life of the church? And finally, what is your response to this portrayal of the future of the United Methodist Church, which does not require the creation of anything, but rather a radical move back to our roots? Thank you for listening.